Hi, class, and welcome to chapter 14, which will be on the autonomic nervous system. And after getting through chapter 13, you'll be happy to hear that chapter 14 just has one part to it. The autonomic nervous system consists of motor neurons that will innervate smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and glands, and it will make adjustments to ensure optimal support for body activity. So, for example, it will shunt blood to areas that need it, adjust heart rate, blood pressure, and digestive processes. It operates via subconscious control. So your autonomic nervous system operates without your knowing. It's also called the involuntary nervous system or the general visceral motor system because it's taking care of all the processes within your visceral organs. So we're going to look at the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. And you should know well the differences between the two. I think I have a 4-point question. I just made the exam, so if you're listening, good for you. There's a 4-point question on the exam listing differences between the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So understanding the difference between the two will be great. So your autonomic nervous system versus your somatic nervous system both have motor fibers, but they differ in the effectors, so what they are affecting, their pathways, ganglia, and the target organ responses to different neurotransmitters. So for example, in the effectors, your somatic nervous system innervates only skeletal muscles. So this was usually under voluntary control. And your autonomic nervous system innervates cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And that's all under involuntary or subconscious control. In the somatic nervous system, a cell body is in the central nervous system, and a single thick myelinated group A axon extends in the spinal or cranial nerves directly to skeletal muscle. And in the autonomic nervous system, you have a 2-neuron chain pathway with a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. The somatic nervous system neurotransmitter effects, because we're dealing with muscles, the neurotransmitter most often used in the somatic nervous system is acetylcholine, and the effect is always stimulatory. So it stimulates a response in your skeletal muscle to contract. In the autonomic nervous system, since we have these 2 chains of fibers, the preganglionic fiber will release acetylcholine, and the postganglionic fiber will release norepinephrine or acetylcholine at its effector. And the effect can be either stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on the type of receptor. There is some overlap between the two. The higher brain centers regulate and coordinate both systems. Most of your spinal and many cranial nerves contain both somatic and autonomic fibers, and adaptations usually involve both skeletal muscles and visceral muscles. So for example, your active muscles will require more oxygen and glucose to contract, which is a somatic nervous system response, but your autonomic nervous system will overlap and they will help speed up your heart rate and open up airways so that more oxygen and glucose can get to your muscles. So here's just a look at a comparison of the two. It's a good chart to study, kind of just summarizes what we just talked about. So then the two divisions of your autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic division is often called the rest or digest division. So it will promote all maintenance functions, conserving energy. And the sympathetic division is often called the fight or flight division. And this will mobilize the body during any sort of activity. All visceral organs are served by both divisions, so we call that dual innervation, but these divisions will have opposite or antagonistic effects. So for example, we call this dynamic antagonism between the two divisions will maintain homeostasis. So the role of the parasympathetic division, it will keep the body energy use as low as possible. So this is our rest and digest, even while carrying out maintenance activities. So this includes your digestion, diuresis, defecation. An example of someone using their parasympathetic division is a person relaxing after a large meal. So the blood pressure, the heart rate, and respiratory rates will be low. GI tract activity will be high. The pupils will be constricted or smaller because they don't need to allow much light in because they're just resting. And the lenses will accommodate for close vision. The sympathetic division, again, will mobilize the body during activity. This is our fight or flight response to emergency situations, embarrassment, excitement, exercise. It will increase your heart rate, give you a dry mouth, so decrease saliva, make you kind of cold, sweaty skin, and dilated pupils. Your pupils want to enlarge to try to let as much light in as possible. So during vigorous physical activity, what will happen is all blood will be shunted to skeletal muscles in the heart that need extra oxygen. Your bronchioles will be dilated, so they will increase in size to try to allow for more oxygen to be delivered to your muscles. And your liver will release glucose. And again, glucose is needed to enter the cellular respiration cycle, which we'll get to create ATP. So liver releasing glucose is just an effort to create more ATP. The key anatomical difference of the two is the site or origin of the fibers. So parasympathetic fibers are craniosacral. Their nervous system fibers originate in the brain and sacral spinal cord. And sympathetic nervous fibers are thoracocolumbar, meaning they will originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Their relative length of fibers differs a little bit. The location of the ganglia differs a little bit between parasympathetic and sympathetic. And this just gives you some of the anatomical differences between the two, parasympathetic and sympathetic. So where their fibers are located, and a little bit about what organs they innervate. Another kind of good chart to review the anatomical and physiological differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. Again, studying this chart would probably be very sufficient to get a good summary of what we just kind of covered here. So the parasympathetic division, a little bit more about this. It's the craniosacral division because of where the fibers originate. It has long preganglionic fibers extending from your central nervous system almost all the way to the target organs. More key differences. This is showing kind of a parasympathetic chart there. The cranial part of the parasympathetic division, cell bodies are located in the brainstem, and we have preganglionic fibers that run in your ocular motor nerves that help to control smooth muscle of the eyes, causing the pupils to constrict and the lens to bulge for focusing. Facial nerves will stimulate large glands in the head. The glossopharyngeal nerve will stimulate your parotid salivary glands because, again, your parasympathetic division is the rest and digest division, so it'll increase salivary activity. The vagus nerve then accounts for about 90% of all parasympathetic fibers. It will take kind of the parasympathetic activity to the cardiac plexus, which will slow the heart rate, to the pulmonary plexus, which serves the lungs and bronchi. Whenever you see the word plexus, that just means a group of nerves. And the esophageal plexus that helps to form more branches that send nervous system branches to your stomach, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, small intestine, all that are involved in the GI tract stimulation. More about the parasympathetic division, where some of the nerves begin in terms of the sacral region. And that's a look at the parasympathetic division and where the nervous system fibers originate. Again, it's called the craniosacral division because the nerves will begin in the cranial or head region and then the sacral region. The sympathetic division then is a little more complex and innervates more organs. Some structures are innervated only by the sympathetic, like your sweat glands, the erector pili muscle of the hair follicle, and then smooth muscles of all blood vessels. And the sympathetic, again, division is called the thoracocolumbar division because its nervous fibers will originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. And that you can see here. So here's a little more. Your preganglionic fibers will pass through white rami and enter the sympathetic trunk. And the paravertebral ganglia in the sympathetic trunk will vary in size, position, and number. You have 23 paravertebral ganglia in the sympathetic trunk, which you can see here. I won't ask you guys to know how many are a part of each, But here's just a look at the sympathetic trunk. If you remember from anatomy, the sympathetic trunk goes on either side of the spinal cord and includes ganglia reaching out. And here's a little bit more look at the sympathetic division and how the synapses occur in the trunk ganglia and in the collateral ganglia. Again, this is all happening in the sympathetic trunk, which again is just a series of kind of like a ladder of like parallel nerve fibers running on either side of the spinal cord. And this is just a summary of autonomic ganglia that you can see there. More sympathetic pathways with synapses in the trunk ganglia. You can see what the gray and white rami communicants are. I won't ask you guys specific questions about this on this test, but just knowing the basic anatomy of the sympathetic trunk ganglia, and then how it communicates with the spinal nerves going into and out of the spinal cord. So here are the three pathways of sympathetic innervation. So these are just the three different pathways, and you can kind of see here step by step. The first step is that the synapse happens in the trunk ganglion at the same level. So that just means that in order to innervate an organ in sympathetic innervation, the synapse will happen right at the same level as the trunk ganglia, or the synapse in the trunk ganglia will happen at a higher or lower level. For example, if an effector is going to smooth muscles, blood vessels, or the erector pili muscles. Pathways to the head, fibers emerging from T1 to T4 will synapse in superior cervical ganglia, and these fibers will innervate structures in the head, and there will be a branch to the heart. Some of this, actually, I don't think I have many detailed questions about these, the different sympathetic pathways and where their synapses will occur. So you can skip over kind of those three slides. But what that was just talking about is where these sympathetic pathways will synapse or connect to other neurons in order to make their effector known in the different types of organs. Here's pathways with synapses in collateral ganglia, the greater, lesser, and least splanchnic nerves, the lumbar splanchnic nerves, and sacral splanchnic nerves. Again, I won't ask you guys too many questions about the pathways of sympathetic innervation. What I really want you to know is the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems. Synapses in the adrenal medulla. These are preganglionic fibers passing directly to the adrenal medulla without synapsing. And this is important because upon stimulation, the cells in the adrenal medulla can secrete norepinephrine or epinephrine, which will be responsible for this stress response. So it'll help in all kind of sympathetic activity. The adrenal medulla are the little glands that sit on top of your kidneys. Visceral reflexes and visceral sensory neurons, they will send information about chemical changes, stretch, temperature, and any irritation of viscera. The axons will travel in the same nerves as autonomic nerve fibers, and visceral sensory neurons can converge on the same second-order sensory neurons that receive input from somatic sensory neurons. So they play a role in referred pain. Visceral reflex arcs have the same components as somatic reflex arcs that you do need to know: the receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and effector. But there's three main differences. The visceral reflex arc has two consecutive neurons in the motor pathway. The afferent fibers are visceral sensory neurons, and the effectors will always be smooth muscle cells in your internal organs. Again, this is all involuntary subconscious control, cardiac muscle, and glands rather than skeletal muscles. An example of a visceral reflex is the reflex that empties the rectum and the bladder. There's three neuron reflex arcs that exist in the GI tract, and this is what is involved in what we call the enteric nervous system, which is made up of sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor systems involved in the GI tract. So this is just to look at the 5 components of a visceral reflex. And again, viscera has to do with your organs. It'll have the same 5 structures as a somatic reflex going to your skeletal muscles and vary just slightly. The neurotransmitters then involved in the autonomic nervous system are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is released by cholinergic fibers, and norepinephrine is released by adrenergic fibers. And the effects of these neurotransmitters will always depend on whether it binds to what type of receptor. So again, this is a look at a really good comparison of the motor neurons in the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system. We've seen this chart or this graph before, and this is just a really good graph to study a little bit of the differences between the two. So the two types of cholinergic receptors that bind acetylcholine are nicotinic and muscarinic, and they're named after drugs that will bind to them and mimic acetylcholine effects, such as nicotine and muscarine, which is mushroom poison. Nicotinic receptors are found on all postganglionic neurons, whether that's sympathetic or parasympathetic, on hormone-producing cells of the adrenal medulla, and the sarcolemma of skeletal muscle cells at the neuromuscular junction. And the effect of acetylcholine at nicotinic receptors is always stimulatory. So they'll open ion channels to cause a depolarization event to try to stimulate an action potential to occur. Muscarinic receptors then are found on all effector cells stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers. And the effect of acetylcholine at muscarinic receptors can either inhibit or excite the effector or the target organ, and it depends on the receptor type of the target organ. So for example, if acetylcholine binds to cardiac muscle cells, it will slow the heart rate, whereas if it binds to your intestinal smooth muscle cells, it will increase motility. There's two major classes that respond to norepinephrine or epinephrine, and these are alpha or beta receptors. And the effects of adrenergic receptors will depend on which subclass of receptor will predominate on the target organ. So this is just a good kind of summary chart that looks at the difference between the cholinergic and adrenergic receptors, looking at the neurotransmitter that will bind, whether that's acetylcholine or norepinephrine and epinephrine, the receptor type, the locations, and then the effect of the binding. Other than this chart, and giving a good summary, I probably won't ask too many questions of these receptors. This is the selected drug class that can influence the autonomic nervous system, the drug class, the receptor bound, and the effects that it will mimic. And then examples of those drugs like nicotine, propranolol, and then the clinical application. So a lot of times we learn about these receptors and how they bind, because this is where drugs will have their influence. So medications, drugs will mimic, but the binding at these receptors to either have some sort of inhibitory or stimulatory effect on some sort of effector organ. Most visceral organs have dual innervation of the parasympathetic and sympathetic interactions. So action potentials will continually fire. Both autonomic nervous system divisions are partially active at all times, resulting in what we call a basal sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. One division usually predominates, but in a few cases, divisions have what we call a cooperative effect. So for example, dynamic antagonism allows for precise control of visceral activity, where the sympathetic division will increase heart rate and respiratory rates and inhibit digestion and elimination, whereas the parasympathetic division will decrease heart rate, respiratory rates, and allow for more attention involved in your GI tract, digestion, and discarding of wastes. So again, your sympathetic has all the activities that have to do with fight or flight, and your parasympathetic division has all activities that have to do with the rest and digest division. Almost all blood vessels, smooth muscle is entirely innervated by sympathetic fibers only. So this division controls blood pressure even at rest, because your blood pressure is controlled by how tight these smooth muscles kind of are wound around the blood vessels. Sympathetic tone, also vasomotor tone, is the continual state of partial constriction of blood vessels to allow for kind of a faster response to either increase or decrease blood pressure or the contraction of these blood vessels when needed. So it allows your sympathetic system to easily shunt or direct blood where it is needed. The parasympathetic division normally dominates your heart and smooth muscle of digestive and urinary tract organs, and it activates a lot of glands, except for your adrenal and sweat glands. So your parasympathetic will slow the heart rate. It will dictate normal activity levels of digestive and urinary tracts. And these organs also exhibit parasympathetic tone, where they're always slightly activated. The sympathetic division can override these effects during times of stress, and drugs that will block parasympathetic responses will increase your heart rate and cause fecal and urinary retention. Cooperative effects, best example of cooperative effects between the two divisions is seen in control of external genitalia, where the parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers will work in turn to either cause vasodilation for erection and then ejaculation of the semen. So that's really kind of the only cooperative effect where they kind of happen at the same time. Unique roles of the sympathetic division, the adrenal medulla, sweat glands, erector pili muscles, kidneys, and almost all blood vessels receive only sympathetic fibers. And other unique functions of the sympathetic division include thermoregulatory responses to heat. So your sympathetic nerves will dilate your skin blood vessels to allow heat to escape, as well as activate your sweat glands. And when body temperatures drop, they will try to constrict your blood vessels to keep your blood shunted towards the center or core of your body. The release of renin from your kidneys is a sympathetic response. It will in turn activate a system that we'll talk about later that increases blood pressure. So this is the release of renin. And other metabolic effects involve increasing metabolic rates of cells. What that means is increasing metabolic rates of cells means taking in glucose to try to create more ATP. So it will raise blood glucose levels and mobilize fats for use as fuels for generating energy or ATP. Localized versus diffuse effects. Parasympathetic division tends to elicit more short-lived and highly localized control over the effectors. So acetylcholine is quickly destroyed by acetylcholine esterase, so it's very a short-lived response. And your sympathetic division tends to be a longer lasting response because norepinephrine, which is one of the neurotransmitters used in the sympathetic division, is inactivated more slowly. So norepinephrine and epinephrine hormones from your adrenal medulla can have a more prolonged effect because they will last longer. So this, again, is a great chart looking at the effects of the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions on various organs. Again, in this chapter, I mainly ask you those differences of what the parasympathetic and sympathetic does on the various organs. Some homeostatic imbalances, so some clinical significance. Autonomic neuropathy is what we call damage to the autonomic nerves. That is a common complication of diabetes mellitus. An early sign might include sexual dysfunction, and other symptoms include dizziness, poor blood pressure control, urinary incontinence, sluggish eye pupil reactions, and impaired sweating. And the best way to prevent diabetic neuropathy is to maintain good blood glucose levels. So controlling your autonomic nervous system, it's under control of your brainstem, spinal cord, hypothalamus, and cerebral cortex. That's really all you need to know for that. The cerebral input may modify your autonomic nervous system, but like we said before, it does so subconsciously, so you're unaware of it happening. The brainstem and spinal cord controls. The brainstem reticular formation appears to exert most direct influence over the autonomic nervous system. Hypothalamic controls, we have different centers in your hypothalamus which control different parts for heart activity, blood pressure, temperature, emotional responses. Activating through the limbic system signal the hypothalamus to activate the fight or flight system. Cortical controls are connections of the hypothalamus to the limbic lobe to allow more cortical influence on the autonomic nervous system. And this is just kind of takes you through the levels of autonomic nervous system control and where in the brain is kind of taking control for each part of the autonomic nervous system. Disorders of your autonomic nervous system may involve deficient control of smooth muscle activity like hypertension, high blood pressure. So an overactive sympathetic vasoconstrictor response to stress, for example, will cause your blood vessels to constrict, which will lead to high blood pressure. The heart, in turn, must work harder, so your artery walls will be subject to increased wear and tear. It can be treated with adrenergic receptor blocking drugs. Raynaud's disease is a painful, exaggerated vasoconstriction in your fingers and toes. Digits turn pale, then cyanotic, which is kind of a bluish color. It's treated with vasodilators to try to dilate your blood vessels to get blood into your digits. Autonomic dysreflexia is a life-threatening, uncontrolled activation of the autonomic neurons in quadriplegics and people with spinal cord injuries below T6, where their blood pressure will skyrocket, posing an increased risk for stroke. And this is a look at Raynaud's disease, just kind of the decreased blood supply to the tips of your digits. Thanks for listening, guys. This was chapter 14. Good luck studying for the exam. Let me know if you have any questions.